This is Lunchtime Agenda.
Hello and welcome to Lunchtime Agenda. I'm Laura Jays, and today David Murray has handed down his interim report into the financial services industry. It's largely seen as a system that's performing well, but it does need regulatory change. And there's a suggestion that it's too concentrated, perhaps a product of the GFC. Competition and stability in the banking sector is also affected in part by the perception that banks are too big to fail.
The consequence of what happened in the 20th century was that governments got into the game of backing financial systems. And having got in, it means from a perception point of view, it's very hard for a government to get out. It's better for us, I think, to consider that that is the case, and also to reflect that failure can happen. You cannot rule it out.
In the report, there's also veiled references to the future of financial advice currently being debated between the major parties and the crossbench, including Clive Palmer. And just to bring you up to date today on the happenings here in the Senate, the chamber resumed sitting over an hour ago, but the carbon tax legislation has not yet been brought on for debate. Joining me now on my panel is Liberal MP, Member for Wannon, Dan Tehan, and also Parliamentary Secretary Alana McTiernan. Thank you for joining me, both of you. Dan Tehan, first of all, the carbon tax. Is it going to pass today, or what's going on?
Look, today or tomorrow, the most important thing is that it does pass. Obviously, the Senate is working through its processes. I think they're processes which only the Senate and senators themselves can quite understand, but I'm sure that either by the end of today or by tomorrow, we will have seen the carbon tax repeal. And that's the most important thing. The government took a commitment to the Australian people that that's what it's going to do, and we will have acted upon that. And that will be a positive for households. It would also be a positive for the competitiveness of Australian businesses. So let's hope it is today, but if it isn't, I'm sure we'll see it by the end of tomorrow.
And part of this delay is learning how to deal with the crossbench senators, isn't it? I think your Deputy Prime Minister Warren Truss even admitted as much in Party Room today.
Well, look, we have to make sure that we've got 6 of the 8 votes that are on the crossbenches. So that means we've got to be talking with those senators. Some of those senators are new. They've got to understand the processes. They obviously want to make sure that they understand exactly what they're voting for. So it does take a little bit of time. But I think we've got to be patient and we've got to be mature about this, because if I put myself in their situation, I'd want to make sure that I understood the rules and I knew exactly what I was voting for. So we're really going through a bit of a tutorial stage when it comes to these new senators.
The tutorial stage, I like that, Dan Tehan. Alana McTiernan, we did hear a very passionate speech from Bill Shorten in the chamber yesterday saying that Labor, yes, had made mistakes, should have gone to a double dissolution election on the ETS. Yep. You admit that, totally. But are you comfortable with seeing these battle lines drawn going into the next election, particularly as the carbon tax was such a big issue in Western Australia?
Well, I think that an emissions trading scheme, a price on carbon, is just fundamentally a really sound principle. And we even see the Palmerites now acknowledging that we need to have an emissions trading scheme. Now, they have a view that it should start off at zero, but this is the way everywhere in the world is going. There is a recognition across the developed world that we have got to deal with this question of carbon emissions, and that the most effective way of doing that is to have a market-based system, which is an ETS.
Clive Palmer will move this ETS amendment, and it's contingent on his support for direct action. But as I understand it, his amendment will include nations like India moving towards an ETS,
which is probably over the
over the top. So will Labor support Palmer's amendment?
Well, we've obviously got to see what it is that
Unlikely,
he is proposing,
though, if it includes India.
But I tell you what we are very, very clear about, that we need a price on carbon. We need to actually understand that the requirement for us to deal with climate change is actually the most significant. And one of the points I make, I mean, we're already seeing costs of climate change. In Western Australia, we've now seen a 104% increase in our water charges over the last 7 years. We had to move very quickly towards desalination in Western Australia because the climate was drying so rapidly in the Perth and the southwest. We've had to already introduce all of these expensive mechanisms to deal with climate change. This nonsense that the price on carbon was killing our economy, not supported by any of the facts, but what will kill our economy is the failure to deal with climate change.
Okay, hold fire for a moment, Dan. I'm just going to take us live to John Brogden now, responding to the Murray report handed down today.
We're in early days here, but I think David Murray's flagged this as an area of potential concern. Relates to the capacity in self-managed super for people to gear and to borrow in their self-managed super fund and make investments. This, I think, does have the capacity in the medium to long term to undermine the safety and security of the system and the safety and security of those investors who have geared. So I think it is important that he indicates at this stage that's an area for further consideration. The other area he concentrates on, relevant to the Financial Services Council, is financial advice. He makes three, I think, significant recommendations, and that, or should I say, observations for consideration. The first of those is that we need to increase standards for education. The second relates to putting a register in place. Now, on those two, we very strongly support the need for increased education and standards. We think that works, we think it should work, and there should be greater confidence as a consequence. On the other front, he refers to the need for a register. This is sensible policy. What it would mean for consumers is before they deal with a financial advisor, they simply would go online or make a phone call, say to the regulator, and determine whether or not an individual is a licensed financial planner, and then in that knowledge they'd be able to proceed to receive financial advice. We think that's good advice. I'm very happy to take any questions.
So can I just clarify your comments on leveraging in super funds? Are you saying that it would be bad if there was a change in the current leveraging?
No. We think the only superannuation funds that can leverage are self-managed superannuation funds. They are fully 1/3 of the $1.8 trillion, some $600 billion. It's an enormous amount of money. It's only about 10% of people, but it's fully 1/3 of the assets. We think David Murray has appropriately identified there is a risk associated with allowing people to borrow within their super fund and have that risk long term. So we do think this is important for further consideration. We do think his observation is worthy of much more research. It is at the moment a small issue, but if you had hundreds of millions, billions of dollars indeed, that were leveraged against superannuation funds and investments drop, you would have people at the risk of not simply having no money in their superannuation fund, but actually owing money to a bank through their superannuation fund. And that would be a disastrous situation for those consumers and indeed for the system.
The report has made concerns about the quality of financial advice in Australia. Are those criticisms fair?
Look, they have manifestly been fair in too many cases to date. The government, the previous government introduced FOFA. We've got potential amendments to it possibly in play today. We believe both FOFA and the amendments will significantly increase the quality of advice that Australians will receive, and we need to see how that plays out. That deals with the laws surrounding the provision of advice. In terms of the laws surrounding those who provide advice, in terms of their level of education and the capacity for ASIC powers to disqualify them, David Murray has appropriately identified, in our view, in his observations, that there is a need to significantly increase both the powers of ASIC and the requirements for education of advisors. We think that is an area that is important for conversation, and we'd like to see, in particular when it comes to increased educational standards and a register, we're very supportive of those concepts. Thank you.
So John Brogden there, the Financial Advice Council, he's the CEO. Dan Tehan, first to you, and just some reaction there. I just want to pick up on the FOFA reforms, and David Murray's report today is saying that there needs to be improved professionalism of advisors. Would you support a register of rogue advisors or bad apples?
Well, I see that John there has said that his industry would support that. Obviously, the government would need to consult and look at that, but David Murray is eminent. I think, when he speaks, I think he should be listened to. I'd also pick up on the point that John was making with regards to ASIC. I think we do have to also make sure that ASIC is in a position to act and that it can make sure that it's doing its role properly, because I think one of the other criticisms that I've had feedback on is that sometimes ASIC has been too slow in acting, and I think that the point that John made there also is very important.
So just to be clear, just coupling this with the lack or the cutting back of red tape philosophy, you'd rather see ASIC act more quickly than put in place some kind of register?
Well, look, I think we need to have a look at that, but definitely what we've seen previously with the laws that the government put in place in the last term was that we think that they went too far with regards to red tape, that what they were doing was just going to drive the cost of advice too high, which would then mean that people wouldn't seek it at all. So we have to make sure that we get the balance right with all these things. And I think what we need to make sure we do is, when David hands down his final report, which my understanding will be in November, that we have a look what the final recommendations are in that report, and then we consider them seriously. And I would be very surprised, given the reputation that David Murray has, if the Labor Party wouldn't look at those very sensibly as well, and we look to see whether we can agree on where the system needs to go, especially in a newly in the globalised world we operate today.
I want to stick on FOFA for a moment. We'll go more broadly to the inquiry, but I think it's fair to say that David Murray has largely backed in the FOFA reforms that Labor has put in place. Elena, are you happy to see some changes there in this space, the changes I put to Dan, and perhaps depending on what comes out of this report?
I mean, obviously we've got to look at the report's only been released today, but certainly we think that inherent in the comments of Mr Murray is a criticism of the government's attempts to water down the FOFA requirements. I think that's pretty clear. And so our first line is that we want to maintain the provisions that are there, and certainly we would look at these other mechanisms that might make it even stronger. Chris Bowen today has put out a bit of an olive branch to try to resolve the impasse. He said that we would be prepared to exempt any contracts that were entered into before July 2012 when the legislation was introduced. So we'd put in a grandfathering provision there in order to progress this. But I think, the overwhelming weight of opinion in this area is that the FIFO rules are there, that we've introduced, are there for a significant and important reason of consumer protection, and that we've actually got the balance reasonably right in terms of regulation compared to protection.
Dan, an olive branch, are you still negotiating with Clive Palmer? And if this doesn't come to some kind of resolution in the next 2 days, isn't it true that there's then a 6-week parliamentary break and Labor's reforms, as they stand now, will actually kick into gear?
That's right. And look, I'm sure that...
What are we up to with those negotiations?
Well, look, I'm not up to date completely with the detail of where it's at the moment. Obviously, I'm in here, so it's a bit hard to know exactly where they're at. But I think, on both sides of politics on this, we want to make sure that the balance is right. And I think that what Chris Bowen has offered today, it's very good to see that the Labor Party is prepared to be constructive. And look, I'm sure that, the Palmer Party as well are looking at this sensibly and seriously, and I'm sure that the government will weigh up all its options once it's very clear where we need to go and where everyone's final positions are.
Okay, just a final question on this report today. First of all, quite concerning that the Murray report has said that affecting perhaps competition and stability is this perception that the big banks are too big to fail. How do you reverse that?
Well, I think under the Hawke-Keating government, we did actually prevent there being even smaller numbers of bigger institutions. So I think we've got to ensure that we have organisations and institutions that are are big enough to survive, and also that we've got a robust regulatory regime and have the possibility of new entrants. But I guess it was always that four pillars policy that was there, making sure that preventing those companies, those banks from further amalgamating, to ensure that there was at least a baseline of competition, and other rules that we introduced that made it much more easy for people to move between banks, that limited the ability for banks to lock people into their system, maximising disclosure rules around those four institutions.
I think the important point that David Murray made was this idea of competitive neutrality. So it's not a matter of sort of saying to the banks, all right, you're no longer in a position to sort of maintain your status. What he's saying is we need to ensure that other players can match and compete. So the concept of competitive neutrality that he mentions, I think, is crucial in how we go about getting more competition into the system.
Okay, stay with us. Plenty more to discuss here on Lunchtime Agenda. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back.
Whatever their personality, every dog deserves leading nutrition. For healthy digestion, a shiny coat, immune support, and healthy teeth, choose Pedigree.
You don't often think about energy, but at Origin it's all we do. Like the gas it takes to make your morning cuppa. We've been planning it for years. We explore, generate and buy energy fresh every day.
1 in 6 Australian children have a vision issue, so OPSM has created Penny the Pirate, a free book to screen your child's vision. Download the free tablet app or get your book in store. OPSM loves eyes.
We're all busy, but sometimes we put off the most important things, like helping to provide financial support for your family if the worst should happen.
Good afternoon, Real Insurance, Lucinda speaking. How can I help you?
Hi, it's Jasmine here. Your ad for life insurance says I can take cover out over the phone. Is that right?
That's right, Jasmine. Would you like a quick quote?
Yes, please.
Okay, so as long as you're an Australian resident, aged 18 to 64, you can apply for a benefit amount from $100,000 to help give you and your family peace of mind.
Great.
You won't need a medical or a blood test to apply, just a few health and lifestyle questions. To give you a quote, I just need to get your age and your smoker status.
I'm 32 and a non-smoker.
So if you apply for a $200,000 benefit amount, your premium could be just $2.92 per week.
Well, that's less than I thought.
And as a thank you, after the first 12 months, we'll also refund 10% of the premiums you've paid in that time. That's the real reward.
Perfect.
Don't put life insurance off any longer. Call us now on 1300 303 459 or search Real Life Insurance. We'll be there.
Have you been up all night?
I'm looking for hotel deals.
Why didn't you just go to Hotels Combined? They compare hundreds of travel sites in seconds.
Hotels Combined.
Find the best price in seconds at hotelscombined.com.
Want an everyday bank account that's completely fee-free and the flexibility to bank the way you want? Introducing Citibank Plus. Enjoy the flexibility of free banking, either at a Citibank branch or free access to one of the largest ATM networks in Australia, with many more around the world. Enjoy the ease of banking on the go with free mobile and tablet banking services. Enjoy the freedom of shopping with your new Visa debit card, in-store, online or overseas, completely fee-free. Plus the added convenience of PayWave. You can even make fee-free international money transfers. Plus, enjoy free wine every time you dine with the Citibank Dining Program. So rethink banking. Switch to Citibank Plus today.
It's Mum's recipe. A steaming, bubbling history lesson in home cooking. It's overloaded and it's lopsided. This pie is made with love. This pie is made with Western Star.
Welcome back. Joining me on my panel today is Dan Tehan and Alana McTiernan. Now, just back on the carbon tax. Now, we have heard repeatedly, Dan Tehan, from the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, this average of $550 saving. But not everyone of your constituents is going to see that saving and actually see that cash go into their pocket, will they?
Well, look, I think the most important thing is that households will be better off once the carbon tax goes, and the industries in my electorate will be. For instance, dairy farmers, you know, on average $8,000 to $10,000 was the estimated cost. If you look at a company like Murray Goulburn, the largest, they've got the largest dairy processing plant in Australia in my electorate, $16 million carbon tax bill. That's the important thing. We're getting rid of the carbon tax. All those benefits will flow through to the consumers and families.
Dan, that will translate into cents per product though. So how can that company expect to pass on the savings when they probably absorbed the cost of the carbon tax when it was introduced?
Well,
do you accept that as a reasonable argument for business to put forward?
Oh, look, businesses had to absorb costs just like farmers have had to absorb costs. That's the nature of our industries on the whole, because they compete overseas. So they have to absorb the cost. They can't pass them on. Otherwise, they're not internationally competitive. And that's why we want to get rid of the carbon tax, because it was putting an additional cost on our businesses. And what happens is if they can't pass those on, they have to absorb them. But what you see, that's less money in their pockets to be spent in the community. So you see, as a result, demand for goods in the country towns declines. So overall...
Still hard to see that $550 figure, even on average.
It's not going to happen. I mean,
well,
you've got Woolworths, for
let's
example. Woolworths saying, look, the prices didn't go up with the carbon tax, so they're not going to go down with the deletion of the carbon tax. I mean, it's pretty simple. You're not going to see...
Well, we've had our electricity providers come out quite clearly and say that...
Electricity's a different story, though.
No one is denying that. No one's denying that. But we're getting down to about $250 a year. And what we're seeing is all of these other cuts that are going on to the community, cuts in childcare benefits, cuts in family tax benefits, future cuts in pensions, cuts in entitlements, to cover the fact that we're now going to have to pay $2 billion to pay polluters to clean up their act.
But to be fair,
and we've no longer
the Prime Minister is going off Treasury figures. So were Treasury figures wrong?
Well, what is quite clear is that those figures aren't, that the prices weren't put up as was projected. I mean, if you've got the major retailers saying there won't be any price decrease because of this, I mean, I think that's going to be a pretty reliable indication.
They were Treasury figures which were put in place when you were in government. And the other important question here, which I think we haven't discussed today, is where are the Labor Party going to go when they reintroduce their carbon pricing or carbon tax, or they develop their policy in the legislation? Because it was, under your modelling, it was scheduled to go up, so it was going to go up to $38. Ultimately, in the end, by 2050, we were looking at a price around $380. So will that be in all your modelling?
I'll tell you what will be in our modelling. It will be an emissions trading scheme that is tied to the basic rate that is being charged around the world. Look, we've
more immediately.
Listen, this is a huge issue that you've got to address.
I do want to look at the budget more immediately.
No, it's the policy we took to the last election. An ETS was the policy we took to the last election, as was the ETS, the policy
we've got to move on. We've got to
last election you said you were abolishing the carbon tax. You're not doing
we've got to move on. This is not going anywhere. Now, the budget, still a few hurdles there in the Senate. Dan Tehan, Peter Costello has criticised the budget strategy largely today. Do you think that's a bit of a fair criticism looking at where we're at the moment?
Well, I don't think he so much criticised the budget. I think what he said is that we need to be out there making sure we inform the public.
He's criticised the sales pitch then.
Yeah, I think he's really added another variable that we can consider, and that's an intergenerational report, because I think the main theme of his message is that we have to be informing the Australian people of the need for us to fix the budget mess that we've been left, because otherwise all we're doing is leaving future generations with the bill. And I think that's
ditto on our position in carbon emissions. I mean, if there is an intergenerational theft going on in this country, it is what you guys are doing.
Well, we have policies put in place, our policies to put in place to address
Pollute now,
this.
pay later.
No, it's not.
Now,
We've got a direct action policy which will meet the targets, which are bipartisan targets that we've both agreed on.
Direct action isn't even going to get through because Clive Palmer's not supporting it.
Well, let's wait and see what Clive does.
You're very optimistic. You're very optimistic.
But can I tell you also on this, you know, some of the biggest reaction
I'm learning a lot
this
today,
budget,
Elena. You've been very informative. You're teaching me a lot.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is that young people are the ones that are very hostile to this budget because they're seeing the increased cost to do an apprenticeship, increased cost for a university education. They feel very deeply aggrieved. So I don't know whether the idea of that you're going to be able to package this pig up and sell it to young people as an intergenerational issue is going to work.
So at least you're admitting, though, that we are burdening future generations with our debt from today.
No,
that is what we're doing.
What you're doing.
So we aren't. So who pays the debt off?
You are privatising the debt.
Who pays the debt off?
Let's get this straight. On any
no, just ask that question. Who pays the debt off?
Well, the debt is a manageable level of debt that you would expect a developed.
It's going to keep growing and growing.
I've let you go for a while, but let me interject. Now we are just a couple of minutes away from question time, but finally, it seems at the moment, Dante, that Clive Palmer is a bit of a sacred cow, for want of a better term, because no one is willing to criticise him at the moment. Is the government too scared?
No, I think we'll sort of go back to where we started. I think there's a sort of a tutorial process going on at the moment, and we've got to be patient and mature with the Palmer United Party, teach them how the Senate works, teach them about keeping to their election commitments, make sure...
That's a good one.
Make sure
that's a good one.
Well, I mean... We're debating the carbon tax, and I think there's been no better illustration from your side about keeping to election promises or lack thereof.
No,
but I think we've got to make sure we've got to be mature, not talk over people, you know, have dialogues with people and explain to them what we're trying to do as a government. If we do that, we'll be successful.
I have to say, we take a certain karmic pleasure in watching some of the difficulties of government because Tony Abbott was a wrecking ball for 4 years, and it is quite, I say, we take some interest in the fact
karmic
that his
pleasure. Okay, I am just going to have to leave it there. Lana McTehan and Dan Tehan, it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alana.
And that is it for Lunchtime Agenda today. We now take you to question time on the floor of the House of Representatives.